Good morning. It is Wednesday, September the 25th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, because I'm the only one who makes the presumption for the status quo. This as opposed to the reactionary traditionalists like Rush Limbaugh who resist change at all costs. My podcast is about being a true conservative and using true conservatism to beat the left each and every day. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hardgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican and then became a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party. I'm now a registered independent and a true conservative. I was taught by the left how to dress, how to act, what to take seriously, and who to associate with. When I decided to vote Republican, I thought that I could act like a liberal but vote conservative and still consider myself a conservative. I was wrong. Whenever I engaged a liberal in debate, I couldn't win. I couldn't win because I couldn't be taken seriously and because I didn't understand the debate dynamic between left and right. I talked conservative, but I acted left. I used lefty lingo, I dressed like the left, I engaged in petty vice, and associated with people who engaged in vice. People who used drugs, gambled, consorted with prostitutes, stole, and cheated. I failed to recognize that the debate dynamic was between psychology, things that are imaginary, and philosophy, things that are real. It's no wonder that the people around me didn't take me seriously. So I realized that defeating the liberals and socialists starts with getting my act together, by not only voting conservative, by talking, dressing, and acting conservative, by refusing to associate with common criminals and ne'er-do-wells, by being aware of and resisting left-wing counterculture, and by using my intellect to defeat psychological bullying and intimidation. By becoming a true conservative, I will not only win, I will never lose, because I have learned that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win. The purpose of my broadcast is to share with my audience the lessons I have learned on how to defeat the left each and every day. Today, I will give an example of left-wing countercultural domination by describing an encounter that I had with a customer servant. And then I will continue reading chapter 4 of A False Kind of Christianity by Dan Jensen, covering the first principle of the existence of God. All that when I come back. Thank you very much. Welcome back. Yesterday I had an encounter with a person that was supposed to be giving me customer service. This is a person that I have a standing appointment with every Friday at 8:30. So yesterday he texted me asking to reschedule the meeting for Thursday at the same time. I said yes with a condition, and the condition was that he give me a reminder call on Wednesday night. He complained that he was busy and asked me to remind myself. Now, this represents a classic example of the left-wing countercultural domination in this country. Rush Limbaugh says we might end up like Europe if we're not careful, but believe it or not, socialism is already here, and shame on Mr. Limbaugh for not seeing it. The conversation I had with Mr. Customer No Service shows that the business dynamic in this country has been turned over to the left. In this conversation, Mr. Customer No Service expects the employees' wants and needs to take priority over the customers. The left wants the employee to be the center of the business universe when, as a matter of reality, it is the wants and needs of the customer that should take precedence. And as far as the rest of the conversation with this customer servant is concerned, I refused. I told him that I will not remind myself and that he should remind me. So we'll see whether or not he reminds me tonight, and I will let you know tomorrow. But when I return, I will continue reading chapter 4 of Dan Jensen's book, A False Kind of Christianity, including the existence of God. Thank you very much. And now continue with Chapter 4 of A False Kind of Christianity, a conservative evangelical refutation of progressive Christianity. When I left off yesterday, I'd covered the first principles of the basics of deduction, the basics of empirical investigation, the basics of right and wrong, and the basics of greater and lesser. And now we will move on to the existence of God. The 10th and final overarching first principle of knowledge that we will discuss here is the existence of God. This principle does not state that all people have an innate understanding of God in a very full sense. Now, of course, we will never have a very full understanding of God even after we've been in heaven for millions of years. So with that made clear by very full understanding, I'm talking about the understanding of God that can be ascertained after a great deal of studying God's revelation. But most of that knowledge comes from using the first principles to come to further conclusions, both by deduction and by using them to investigate the world. When I say that the knowledge of God's existence is a first principle, I simply mean that all people have a general and somewhat vague sense that an absolutely perfect being exists that alone is to be worshipped and that can alone fulfill us. Most do not flesh this out very much, but perfection in the fullest sense of that term means the absence of all flaws or limitations. Hence, God is infinite. Now, again, most do not flesh out very much what infinitude entails, although we will in the next chapter. But we do understand on a basic level that infinitude is the absence of limitation. This is not to be confused with mathematical infinitude, which in reality does not exist and cannot exist. But it still is used as a general concept. We simply mean that infinitude involves being unhampered by any limitations whatsoever. We also mean that it makes no sense to say that something is infinite in one way while not being infinite in others. Infinitude knows of no degrees. Hence, to say that something could be infinite in knowledge but not in power is to fly in the face of reason. Many try to use science to get around this principle as well, based on the very famous and popular work of Stephen Hawking. Many assert that the universe is infinite on some level, but the fact of the matter is that Hawking's theory has not been proven as fact. He is undoubtedly astonishingly brilliant, but not all scientists agree with him. Therefore, we can know in advance that his findings are not fully reflective of reality precisely because we instinctively know that the universe cannot be infinite, since it is not infinite in all ways. We all instinctively know, regardless if we think about this fact all that much, that this God has revealed himself to us in a general sense. Through these first principles, the inferences we can draw from these first principles, as well as through nature, which can be examined by the application of the first principles and the inferences drawn from them. But we also instinctively know that God has revealed himself to us beyond these basic truths. All of us long for the answers to the deeper questions of life, such as why are we here? What is our purpose? Where are we going? Etc. And we all instinctively know that if we seek God, he will give us the answers to these questions. In the next few sections, I will be detailing a number of ways people try to abuse or get around these first principles we have just covered. We will see that all of these attempts fall far short of these goals of those who make them. Before we do so, I want to clear up one thing that may have been confusing, and that is what exactly do I mean by inferences we can draw from the first principles of knowledge without recourse to the natural world. There are a number of examples of this, but the clearest would be in mathematics. It is not a first principle of knowledge, for example, that 4 times 4 is 16. If you tell that to someone who has never studied any math whatsoever, they will not automatically understand this to be the case. However, we can come to that conclusion using deduction and the first principles without recourse to the natural world. It is a first principle that math is possible. This means that we all have a basic instinct that we live in a world full of individual things that can be added, subtracted, multiplied, divided, etc. But we can take that first principle and use deduction to come to all sorts of concrete mathematical conclusions that we do not automatically possess instinctively, all without investigating the natural world. It is true that one could take 4 sets of 4 muffins per set and just count them to come to the number 16. In this case, the natural world is being used to come to a mathematical conclusion beyond the basic first principles. However, and this is key, it is not absolutely necessary to count the muffins, or anything else for that matter, to know beyond doubt that 4 times 4 equals 16. We can simply do the math in our head. Now, many will object that the natural world still plays a major part here, as the first principle includes the notion that we live in a real world full of things that can be manipulated mathematically. However, what is being said here, as was explained earlier, is not what we do, is not that we do not gain a great deal of information from the natural world through experience when we are young, but that we reach a certain point in our development when we can begin to come to solid conclusions about how to understand this experience. The first concrete step is the first principles. After this, we test things through a blend of inferences drawn from the first principles and our investigation of the natural world. It is true that most young kids learn that 4 times 4 is 16 well before they reach this testing point in their development. The key point, though, is that they can test this assertion without recourse to the natural world. But they cannot test the assertion that Lincoln was the 16th president apart from a robust investigation of the empirical data empirical data taken from the natural world. It is also important to note that when investigating the natural world, we also make necessary inferences at every point along the way. The crucial point that is being made here is that while that is certainly true, there nevertheless exists a plethora of necessary inferences that can be made from the first principles that are not dependent on further investigation of the natural world. The clearest example being the mathematical conclusions that we can reach. And the next section here is going to be called the charge of arbitrariness. And he's going to get into all of the ways that the left tries to duck and dodge all of these first principles. They duck and dodge all these first principles because they know socialism can't stand up to reality, to logic, to reasoning. So what they do is their attitude is, if socialism can't stand up to reality, then there must be something wrong with reality. That's their backward thinking. Okay, and so they use a lot of subterfuge and a lot of ways of trying to get around the first principles and basically try to get around reality. So chapter 4, or let me just say this book is important because it talks about the influence of that the left has and is attempting to have over another aspect of American culture, namely the church. And chapter 4 is important because it demonstrates the foundations of not only Christianity, but all intellectual endeavors, and shows you how the left attempts to subvert those foundations. Back in a minute. Thank you. In conclusion, I've given you evidence of the extent to which the left dominates our culture by recalling a conversation that I had with a customer servant and by reading from the book A False Kind of Christianity, a conservative evangelical refutation of progressive Christianity. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He is open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.